Long before Paul Anka was rubbing shoulders with Frank Sinatra or writing the anthem that would become Sinatra's immortal signature, he was just a restless boy in Ottawa, Canada. The son of Syrian-Lebanese immigrants who believed in hard work, tradition, and the value of keeping one's head down. But Paul? He was wired differently. From the start, his gaze was fixed not on the quiet routines of small-town life, but on the glowing lights of a stage he hadn't yet found. Ottawa in the 1940s was a place of snow-covered streets and modest shops, a city far removed from the glamour of Hollywood or the smoky lounges of Las Vegas. Anka's father ran a restaurant, his mother kept the home. To most, Paul's future looked predictable. He might inherit the family business, live a comfortable but ordinary life, and never step beyond the city's safe borders. But young Anka was restless, always scribbling notes in the margins of his school books, humming melodies that seemed to come from nowhere, and sneaking into church choirs just to hear how harmony could swell and lift a room. It wasn't long before his passion began to look like obsession. While other kids were busy with hockey games and after-school jobs, Paul was writing songs, knocking on doors, and begging for a chance to be heard. His classmates might have laughed at the boy who dreamed too loudly, but Anka wasn't bothered. Deep down, he knew he wasn't destined to serve tables in his father's diner. He was destined for something bigger. At just 14, Paul began sneaking away to amateur talent contests, his small frame and youthful face belying a voice brimming with yearning. There was something magnetic about him, a spark of desperation mixed with innocence. He wasn't polished, not yet, but he was hungry. And hunger, in show business, is more dangerous than talent. Hunger keeps you pushing when the doors slam shut. Hunger makes you climb back after the crowd boos. Hunger forces you to believe that even the impossible is only one lucky breakaway. NTHAT break came faster than anyone expected. In 1957, a gangly, wide-eyed Paul Anka wrote a song about an older girl who had rejected him. Her name was Diana Ayub. She worked at his church and barely noticed the awkward boy with the notebook. But Paul noticed her. His crush became obsession, and obsession became lyrics. Diana was raw, unpolished, dripping with teenage desperation, but it was also unforgettable. NHE recorded the song in New York with a small label that barely believed in him. The executives thought the boy was naive, maybe even delusional. Yet when the record hit the airwaves, something clicked. Diana was lightning in a bottle, a teenage anthem for a generation hungry for its own voice. Within months, the song sold over 10 million copies worldwide. Paul Anka, still in high school, was suddenly one of the biggest stars on earth. Imagine the whiplash. One day he was eating sandwiches in his father's diner. The next, he was flying to England to perform before shrieking crowds, chased by paparazzi, his face plastered on magazine covers alongside Elvis Presley and Buddy Holly. For a boy from Ottawa, it was dizzying. For the music industry, it was a shockwave. This wasn't just another teen idol. This was a songwriter, a hustler, a dreamer who had cracked the code before he was old enough to drive. In BUT, with the fame came whispers. Industry insiders sneered that he was just a passing fad, another clean-cut boy who'd be forgotten when the next Elvis came along. And maybe they would have been right if Paul Anka weren't already planning his reinvention. For him, Diana wasn't just a hit. It was a ticket into the ruthless, glittering, and dangerous world of show business. A world where success was never guaranteed, and survival meant constantly staying one step ahead. And Paul Anka, though barely 16, was already learning how to play the game. For a moment, it seemed like Paul Anka had conquered the world before he even knew how to navigate it. He was barely old enough to vote, but he was already being compared to Elvis Presley, sharing stages with Buddy Holly, and basking in the adoration of fans who screamed his name until their voices cracked. Yet behind the cheers, the bright lights carried a darker truth. The industry had seen stars like him before, and it was already sharpening its knives. NTHE late 1950s were a cruel time to be a teenage heartthrob. Labels milked young talent, chewing them up with relentless touring schedules, photo ops, and recording demands. The press packaged Anka as a squeaky clean boy next door, ignoring the fact that he was far more ambitious than his peers. While other teen idols coasted on charm, Paul studied contracts, watched producers like a hawk, and memorized the mechanics of publishing rights. Even then, he knew fame was fleeting. But ownership, the ability to write and control songs, could last forever. Still, being a teenage superstar was intoxicating. Anka toured relentlessly, performing in Europe, Asia, and the US, treated like royalty wherever he went. His smooth voice and boyish charm melted borders. Yet even as his fame exploded, cracks began to show. The pressure was suffocating. His father's diner in Ottawa felt a world away, and the grounding influence of home faded as Paul was swept into a whirlwind of late nights, hotel rooms, and constant scrutiny. NTHE Industries' cruelty was merciless. For every fan screaming his name, there were executives calling him replaceable, critics dismissing him as, quote, just another teenage fad. And perhaps most cutting of all, the music landscape was about to change in ways no one could have predicted. NBY the early 1960s, the British invasion arrived. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and a tidal wave of new sound shook the foundation of pop music. Teen idols who once ruled the charts were suddenly relics of a bygone era. Many disappeared overnight, their names reduced to trivia questions in the shadows of Lennon and McCartney. For Paul Anka, the threat was real. At just 22, he was already being labeled as, quote, over, NBUT. Here's where his story veers sharply from the others. Where most teen idols faded, Paul pivoted. He refused to let himself be swallowed by the tide. Instead of chasing trends, he doubled down on what he knew best, songwriting. He began writing not just for himself, but for others. Tom Jones, Connie Francis, even Buddy Holly before the plane crash that shocked the world. His songs carried weight, wit, and staying power. Still, this reinvention came at a price. The fame he once basked in, the screaming girls, the flashing bulbs, dulled. The checks weren't as large, the spotlight not as bright. He had escaped the trap of being a disposable teen idol, but survival meant sacrifice. The boy who had once shaken the world with Diana was now learning the cold truth of show business. Talent wasn't enough. Reinvention was survival. And it was this survival instinct, sharp, calculating, relentless, that would soon lead Paul Anka to cross paths with the most powerful and dangerous entertainer of all time, Frank Sinatra. By the mid-1960s, Paul Anka was no longer just the fresh-faced teen who had conquered the charts with Diana. He was a survivor, reshaping himself as a songwriter, businessman, and performer. But fate, as it often does in show business, had a larger role in mind for him. And it came in the form of a stormy night, a chance encounter with a French melody, and the most powerful voice in American music history. Frank Sinatra. NTO understand how extraordinary this collision was. You have to picture the contrast. Sinatra was the chairman of the board, the living embodiment of swagger, danger, and control. By the time Anka was carving his way into the industry, Sinatra had already survived the big band era, conquered Hollywood, and reinvented himself as the ultimate Las Vegas icon. But Sinatra's world was not built on innocence. His empire was steeped in whispers of mob ties, violent outbursts, and a reputation that terrified even his closest friends. And Paul Anka admired Sinatra from a distance. Like many, he grew up idolizing him. But admiration wasn't enough. Anka's ambition wasn't to watch Sinatra from the sidelines. It was to write something that would forever bind their names together. NTHAT chance came in 1967, while Anka was on a trip to France. One night, he stumbled across a haunting French ballad called Comme d'habitude, a melancholy tune about routine and fading love. Most would have dismissed it, but Anka heard potential buried beneath the lyrics. He bought the rights, tucking the melody away like a secret weapon. Months later, back in New York, Anka had dinner with Sinatra. Over drinks, Sinatra confessed he was tired. Tired of the endless touring, tired of the music business, tired of being pushed to keep performing. "I'm quitting," Sinatra told him bluntly. "I'm done." NFOR Anka, it was a revelation. If Sinatra was truly ready to hang it up, what better way to exit than with a song that captured everything about his life? Defiance, pride, and a refusal to apologize for living on his own terms. That night, during a thunderstorm, Anka sat at his typewriter and began hammering out new lyrics to Comme d'habitude. He wrote through the storm until morning, channeling Sinatra's voice in his head. By dawn, the French ballad had become something else entirely, a declaration of identity, a final bow, a thunderous refusal to go quietly. He called it My Way. When Anka played it for Sinatra, the reaction was immediate. "That's it," Sinatra said. "That's my song." And when he recorded it in 1969, the world felt the same. My Way wasn't just another track. It became Sinatra's anthem, a song that defined him in life and in death. Funerals, farewells, and grand stages across the globe would echo with those lyrics, cementing it as one of the most enduring songs of the 20th century. NBUT behind its triumph was Anka's genius. Few knew the song had been born from a French ballad. Few realized that the immortal words weren't Sinatra's. They were Anka's. And though Sinatra sang it as if it had been carved from his own soul, it was Paul who had pulled lightning from the sky and put it on paper. NTHE's success of My Way transformed Anka's reputation overnight. No longer dismissed as a teen idol of the past, he was now the man who gave Sinatra his defining masterpiece. He had secured his place in music history, but he had also stepped deeper into Sinatra's world. And Sinatra's world, as Anka would soon learn, was one where the spotlight shone bright, but the shadows could be deadly. Writing My Way had catapulted Paul Anka into the inner circle of Frank Sinatra, a place most entertainers dreamed of, but few survived unscathed. On the surface, it was glamorous. Dinners in Las Vegas showrooms, long nights filled with laughter, cocktails, and stories only legends could tell. Sinatra treated Anka not as a kid who got lucky, but as a trusted ally, a songwriter who had given him a legacy. For Paul, it was validation. The boy from Ottawa had earned a seat at the most exclusive table in entertainment, but sitting at that table came with a price. Sinatra's world wasn't built solely on applause and record sales. It was built on power. And power in Las Vegas, in the 1960s and 70s, was inseparable from the mob. Everyone knew it. The casinos were mob-controlled, the clubs were mob-financed, and anyone who stepped onto those stages was playing by rules they didn't write. Sinatra, with his charm and undeniable talent, had become the ultimate bridge between Hollywood, politics, and organized crime. He counted mob bosses as friends, posed for photographs with men others feared to cross, and wielded his influence like a weapon. Paul Anka, though ambitious, wasn't blind. He saw the whispers made flesh. He watched as deals were struck not with contracts, but with nods and handshakes. He learned quickly that in Sinatra's orbit, you didn't ask too many questions, and you certainly didn't say the wrong thing. Even the boldest stars tiptoed carefully around the chairman of the board. One outburst, one insult, one step too far, and careers could be ended. Or worse. There were stories, countless stories, traded in hushed tones backstage. A comedian who bombed at a Vegas club and made a sly joke about Sinatra? Gone from the strip overnight. A musician who thought he could negotiate harder for his fee. He never worked with Sinatra again, his phone calls unanswered, his bookings mysteriously canceled. These weren't accidents, they were reminders. In a world where Sinatra shook hands with presidents and mobsters alike, nobody dared test his reach. Anka was young, but he was no fool. He walked the tightrope carefully, blending loyalty with quiet independence. He admired Sinatra, yes, but he also feared him. My Way had bonded them, but that bond was double-edged. To stand close to Sinatra was to bask in his glow, but it was also to stand close to fire. One wrong move, and you could burn. And yet, this closeness gave Anka something else: perspective. He saw the unspoken rule of Las Vegas. Survival wasn't about talent alone. It was about alliances, about knowing when to stay silent, and about keeping your own sins hidden while never exposing someone else's. It was a world where artists became pawns, casinos became battlegrounds, and the mob kept its hand firmly on the scales. NFOR Paul. These lessons cut deep. He wasn't a mobster, but he had learned the mob's greatest secret. Control isn't about what you show, it's about what you withhold. He watched Sinatra wield this power effortlessly, smiling for cameras, charming audiences, then disappearing into closed-door meetings that shaped destinies. By the time the 1970s rolled around, Paul Anka wasn't just a songwriter or a Vegas headliner. He was a man who had stared into the machinery of fame and understood its cost. He knew how fragile success could be, how quickly it could be snatched away if you angered the wrong man, or worse, the wrong men behind the wrong man. In S.O., he kept moving forward, careful, but relentless. He wrote for Tom Jones, She's a Lady, for Michael Jackson, This Is It, decades later, and continued to reinvent himself while keeping his ties to Sinatra close. But not too close. It was a balancing act that would define much of his career. Ambition, tempered by survival, creativity sharpened by fear. Because in Sinatra's world, you never forgot who was watching. If Paul Anka's professional life was a study in reinvention, his personal life was a drama all its own, filled with dazzling highs, painful lows, and battles that played out not just in private but in public courts and headlines. For every song that soared up the charts, there was a heartbreak waiting in the wings. In 1963, at the height of his early fame, Anka married Anne de Zogeb, the daughter of a Lebanese diplomat. Their union had the sheen of a fairy tale. A teenage idol turned international star marrying a striking fashion model. The wedding was lavish, the photographs beaming with youthful promise. Together, they had 5 daughters, and for years, it seemed like Anka had mastered the impossible balance. A glittering career on one side, a sprawling family on the other. NBUT fame has a way of straining even the strongest bonds. Anka's touring schedule was relentless. Nights in Vegas bled into weeks on the road. His charm, the same magnetism that drew fans, sometimes led him into temptation. Rumors of infidelities followed him, whispered in green rooms and reported in tabloids. By 2001, after nearly 4 decades together, Paul and Anne divorced. Quietly, without scandal, but not without sorrow. NIF. His first marriage ended with weary resignation. His second was a firestorm. In 2008, at age 67, Anka married Anna Aberg, a much younger Swedish model and actress. The marriage raised eyebrows from the start. Friends described it as passionate but volatile, marked by public arguments and whispered stories of mistrust. Within 2 years, the relationship imploded, leaving behind not just bitterness, but a fierce custody battle over their son, Ethan. The courtroom fight was ugly, the kind of legal war that strips away every layer of celebrity polish. Allegations flew from both sides, each trying to paint the other as unfit. For Anka, the battle was more than legal. It was personal, a test of whether he could keep the one piece of family that fame and fortune hadn't already complicated. In 2017, after years of litigation, he won sole custody of Ethan, an unusual outcome that shocked many and underscored just how determined Anka was to protect what mattered to him most. Beyond marriages and custody fights, Anka's family life remained a tapestry of contradictions. He was the doting father, proud of his daughters and often writing about the joys of fatherhood. But he was also the perfectionist, the man whose drive for control sometimes spilled into his home life. Those close to him describe a man torn between tenderness and intensity, between wanting to shield his family from the chaos of show business and knowing he had already dragged them into it. Through it all, Paul Anka carried the same lesson he had learned in his career. Nothing comes easy, and nothing is guaranteed. Love, like fame, demanded constant work, and when it failed, it left scars. NBUT. If Anka's personal life revealed his vulnerabilities, it also revealed his resilience. Just as he had done with music, he refused to let heartbreak define him. He moved forward, scarred but unbroken, always chasing the next reinvention. Because for Paul Anka, survival wasn't just for the stage, it was for life itself. By the time Paul Anka reached his 70s and 80s, he had lived several lifetimes in one. He was no longer just the teenage idol of the 1950s, nor only the songwriter who gave Sinatra My Way. He was a survivor, scarred, outspoken, and unafraid to reveal the truths that others would have taken to the grave. And when Anka finally decided to speak, the world listened. NHI's memoir, bluntly titled My Way, was less a celebration and more a confession booth. Within its pages, Anka peeled back the glamorous curtain of show business and let readers glimpse the shadows underneath. He spoke candidly of Sinatra, not just the legend, but the man. The anger, the volatility, the moments of brilliance, and the darkness that came with being the most powerful entertainer in America. For years, these stories had circulated in whispers backstage, but Anka put them in ink. And in doing so, he risked anchoring the very machine that had helped make him. NBUT honesty had become his trademark. He didn't stop at Sinatra. Anka wrote about mob connections, affairs, bitter rivalries, and his own missteps. He admitted to being controlling, to being obsessive, to sometimes burning bridges in his ruthless pursuit of survival. For a man once marketed as squeaky clean, these revelations shocked fans who had clung to the memory of the boyish crooner of Diana. But to Anka, telling the truth was liberation NOF course. The controversies didn't stop there. A leaked audio recording of Anka berating his crew backstage painted him as a tyrant, his voice filled with fury and expletives. Critics pounced, eager to tarnish his legacy. But in typical Anka fashion, he didn't apologize. Instead, he leaned into it. "That's who I am," he said, framing it not as shame, but as proof of the fire that had fueled his survival in an unforgiving industry. Even in his later years, Anka refused to slow down. He headlined concerts, experimented with Broadway, and reimagined his classics for new generations. He recorded swing versions of contemporary songs, proving that reinvention wasn't a phase, it was his DNA. And while some peers faded into nostalgia acts, Paul Anka kept evolving, always chasing the next reinvention, always rewriting his own narrative. Now, at 84, when he reflects on the journey, it's clear that Paul Anka's legacy is more than just music. It's the story of a boy who clawed his way out of Ottawa, who stood beside giants, who walked into the shadows of Sinatra's empire and emerged intact. It's the story of survival, of reinvention, of never letting the world dictate when you're finished. Most of all, it's the story of a man who, against all odds, did it his way.